I am so excited to bring you all my first deck profile now that I have the physical cards in hand, and I felt none was more appropriate than my mid-range Capregal deck. Baron did share this list earlier this year, but I have made some upgrades. I have been testing out some new cards, so I wanted to share this as just, hey, the first deck profile on my channel. It's super exciting, and let's get right into it. So of course, this wouldn't be a Capregal deck without 3 copies of good old Capregal here. I think there is arguments to be made to maybe running 2 copies of it, but I wanted this to be a Capregal deck. So if it's going to be a Capregal deck with no way to search this out or special ascend into it specifically, 3 copies, because I want to see this card. This is how I want to be closing out the game. As I mentioned, it is a mid-range deck, so the idea is to control early on and then start putting on the pressure come the mid game. And the idea of the mid game for me is when my opponent hits about 8 to 10 spirits. So even if they are countering my plays, it's still using up a lot of the resources, running them thin. And Capregal is one of the few water Elestrals that is really great at that, having a naturally high attack stat, or as to say by itself, with its naturally high attack stat and its effect that provides perfect value to set up for more Capregal plays, be able to ascend into it, and also just kind of mitigates one of the downsides of 2-spirit Elestrals, that being that it's just more beneficial to go wide, but as long as this attack connects, you are still going wide. Even if your opponent Earthquakes that or maybe Poison Tipped Arrowed it, they still have another body on board to deal with it. So in terms of just being able to put out constant pressure at that point in the game, I think Capregal is great at that. Now, I just don't want to rely on 3 cards to put on the pressure, hence why I'm running the 3 Galaxea here. I know it is a bit at odds with Capregal, since it does swap Capregal to a 4/7, but the idea is either I'm going for Capregal or I'm going for a Galaxea on board. Just being able to swap the attack of all my Water Elestrals means that this one goes to a 5 attack, can be super offensive, and Water naturally has some high defense power, and that's very true with my deck as well. And Galaxea is just great to turn that stally board, trying to slow down the opponent, control what's going on, into a powerful offense. And even if Galaxea gets bounced back or dealt with, I can find more Galaxea, keep on the pressure. That's kind of the idea of it. So now I have 6 cards that let me do that. And Galaxea also has the added benefit of being a decent card that I can play out even when I'm just trying to control the board state. 5 attack is great for attacking over stuff, and also is very low risk to try to bait out those counter runes from the opponent. And so thus Galaxea kind of serves 2 purposes in this deck. Though I will say sometimes I do try to save it for later in the game, especially if I don't have a follow-up. It just you kind of have to play it by ear since this does have the dual purpose, but ideally you should be able to find multiple Galaxies and Capragals throughout a game to try to close it out. Foamee here is a great one of the early control tools. Being able to flow into stuff when destroyed means that we get great utility into our deck, great toolboxing rather, to find our other pieces. And sometimes that can also be a Galaxea, but we've got some great stuff that I'll show off later. It just means that it's harder for the opponent to actually deal with the board to keep us off stuff, and again, just utility from other Elestral effects. It's a body on board to ascend into Capregal when the time comes. And yeah, just sets up everything. This also is great to dig through the deck to set up Elestrals in the Underworld for Capregal to resummon, and this one actually is pretty good to resummon itself. Especially if there's nothing better in the Underworld. Again, that's more situational, and it'll make more sense once I get into the other Elestrals. And a lot of times, even if you don't get off that great utility effect, what that usually means is the opponent either used like an Earthquake on it, a Poison Tipped Arrow, a Gorgon's Gaze, in which case they're using resources, using other answers for stuff such as Galaxea and Capregal just to stop you from getting some value. So regardless of how this Foamee is dealt with, it usually is a win-win, making this a fantastic card to open up with, start out with, and thus 3 copies. One of the best utility cards to find off of Foamee and also just draw into is Apharos here. This card is our draw engine to help us find a lot of our control pieces. So this itself isn't exactly a control piece. It's more so helping us find it, and also just our beaters for later on in the game. Just being able to Nexus 2 to draw 2 is really strong, and we definitely have cards in here to help us achieve that Nexus. And what I found is if I can get an Apharos to stick for more than a turn and get off its draw effect multiple times, it's very strong. It usually finds her pieces, and the advantage just cascades, because until this Apharos is dealt with, until those spirits hit the Underworld, you pretty much got that card draw for free. A lot of times it can just be a better Nog, and honestly, at worst, it's just a Nog with a body on board. So 3 of this cards, because I also really like opening it and going first, and if I have a card to Nexus off of, such as the Poseidon, the Divine Rune for this deck, and just to draw 2 immediately, I get access to so many more tools. I'm more likely to find my counter runes and just start off the game at a great pace. Moustacean here is just a big body. Throw in defense, and the opponent either needs to use up multiple spirits to deal with it, or has to have a 2-card combo, just because all 1 spirits hit naturally 5 attack. Even another Moustacean on the opponent's board just hits 6, so it can't even hit over it. So just a big volley to stall on. You can also summon it, of course, off of the Foamee here if you just need to stall out some attacks, and then just throw down a Galaxea, and it becomes a 6 attacker regardless. You don't even need to use its effect to switch its stats, and which helps with the beatdown portion of this deck. And then its own ability to swap its stats can come in real handy to help protect itself against the opponent. If maybe they dealt with your Galaxea and it's now vulnerable in attack position, and your opponent throws down Elestral with maybe 4 or 5 attack, you can swap in now. They need something else to deal with it. Does cost Spirit, does sometimes get costly, but also if you really need to just kind of start putting on the pressure, maybe you really need to address something on your opponent's board, just swap its stats and hit in. It does that quite well. So this is our resident big body of the deck. Only 2 copies because you really want to be using your normal cast for other cards such as Foamee. I think puts on more pressure, Apharos to draw cards. And it's fine if you draw into it. Sometimes you do want to cast it, but I think most of the time it's usually in tandem with Galaxea or off of Foamee you want to see it. And 2 copies is, I think, enough to be able to see it when you need it, but not brick on it a ton. I also run 1 Sluggle here just for some extra recovery. The recovery is super important in this deck because it does get pretty expensive. I mean, the Capregal bringing back 1 all the way at the bottom here, so you do need to have a spirit in your underworld to bring back something, so it does cost you an extra spirit. Moustacean if you have to expend. Foamee, you need spirits to be able to float into stuff, so it naturally is a pretty expensive deck, and Sluggle helps make that not the case. If you want to summon off of a Foamee, all of a sudden you're actually netting back 2 spirits. You can even argue that you're even netting back 1 spirit in addition to refunding the Sluggle and the Foamee's cost, however you want to look at it. It's also great off of Capregal for that same reason, and also help refund stuff with Moustacean. Only downside is it's just a smaller body, and also you don't really want to use your normal cast for it. Sometimes it is perfectly fine to do that, but I've definitely had times when I try to run more copies where it feels kind of dead in hand. So I rather have it for the cases where I can special cast it and those few scenarios where it does. And so I relegate the spirit recovery because it is very important to our good old Ambrosia, which I'll go over with later, but still 1 copy feels great for the stack. I also run 1 Tadpuff here. I think this is arguable. I've been running 2 for the longest time. You could run 2. You could honestly even cut it, but I still like having this as a quick button to be able to go into Capregal on an empty board. Maybe just there's a huge exchange the previous turn. My board was wiped. My opponent, I was able to deal with their Elestral with a counter rune, and I just want to get Capregal out to put on the pressure. Actually, that's not the best scenario. I think the better scenario would be maybe my opponent was able to attack over something, but they have no back row. It's just a quick way to go into it and start getting value off of Capregal. That's the better example, and Tadpuff is great for that. Sure, it costs an expend. Other reason why I'd run Sluggle, because it does get a bit expensive, but it lets you turbo it out. But at the same time, it's really only great for that Capregal, and maybe sometimes in the late game just to spawn an extra body on board to be able to hit for 1 can sometimes make the difference, present lethal. But at the same time, in the early game, I really don't want to be seeing this. It just can kind of clog up the hand. It can get expensive, especially if I can't get that momentum late in the game. So I think just that 1 copy for those scenarios where that happens is a-okay, because a lot of times, ideally, there will be a body on board to ascend into Capregal with, or you're just going for Galaxea anyway. Rounding off the Elestrals, I got 2 Peliquarius here, just a great search card to find specific 1 Spirit Water cards. Like going first, opening this, if I don't have the Apharos, this is a phenomenal card to play out. There are some times where I was explaining the count rune exchange where you're left with no bodies on board, but you used a counter rune to get rid of theirs. Well, even if you don't have a buy on board, but you're not looking to really put on the pressure yet, Peliquarius can be a great card just to kind of throw down there when you don't really need to address a board in some way, just to find those threatening pieces. And you got plenty of them, that's for sure. Can even find us our Tadpuff to set up. So just a great consistency card. Just know when the board state is correct to play it, because you certainly don't want to need to be addressing the board state and just throwing down a Peliquarius. It's not an ideal scenario. But 2, because those scenarios definitely do pop up and I want to see them when they do. Moving over to the runes of the deck, starting with the Poseidon here, 3 of the Divine Rune. It is mainly here as the best Nexus target for Apharos to be able to easily set up spirits and start moving them around to get your draw 2. This card also does have some other benefits. You can see the Trident here, but other notable ones are its ability to Nexus a Water Spirit from itself onto a Elestral on board. Well, really any card on board, but let's be real, you're going to be sending it to an Elestral. Just to push out some extra damage in the late game, can help close out a game a bit quicker, put your opponent under more pressure. It does take some skill that I'm still learning myself to know when to do that and when not to, but it's certainly a great utility there. But as I said, it's mostly just there for the Apharos. And I don't run any searchers because I don't think this deck has time to really play out the Elechic, so I do want to max out this card. It does hurt when I see multiple copies of it because I really just need the one, but this is so crucial to find to get advantage going, to get our Trident going, that 3 just felt right. Speaking of Trident, run 2 Trident here for the Trident lock. Don't really need more than that because in the early game for defensive plays, I don't really need it. It's mostly just there to help secure my aggressive push when I'm trying to go for it, just to shut down those counter runes. And also, there's a lot of stuff that it just doesn't shut down. If I don't already have an Elestral on board to equip Trident to before going to Capregal, they can time PTAs before it, they can chain Gorgons in response to me playing it down. So honestly, ideally, this Trident is here to, if my Elestral doesn't get answered and I want to shut down, say, what I think are shields and altars, or it also can be used if I already have an Elestral on board to preemptively set it up, shut down the counter runes, and then be able to go into Capregal or maybe throw out a Galaxea from there, and my opponent doesn't have any room to interrupt. So this is another big skill card, is knowing when to throw it down and when not to, and even I'm still trying to figure out when it's best to do that through the games, because this is a very skill-intensive deck. And also, at worst, this is just a Nexus target for Apharos if I absolutely need the card draw. Moving away from the water-specific ones, I do run the 3 Earthquake here. This is just a great removal card. I mean, so many decks are just slotting in if they can, and this is good for this deck that isn't naturally aggressive until the late game. So usually the opponent sometimes have time to set up stuff, and Earthquake can just deal with it. And as simple as that. Clear the way to make sure that Galaxea, Capricorn, and all that can do their stuff, but also make sure the opponent can't get away with something crazy on their end. Phenomenal removal card, and so crucial for a deck that isn't aggressive and trying to attack over stuff. Moving into the counter runes of the deck, 3 Tsunami to start with, just a staple water card, a great way to slow down the opponent when they try to attack over stuff, as it just changes all non-water enchanted Elestrals to defense positions, so that does not affect most of our Elestrals. The only one it would affect is the Peliquarius, but just a great way to stall for an extra turn. And usually with the offensive Elestrals, they have lower defense than offense, so by changing defense position, it makes it so much easier to actually attack over them if you want to go on the offensive. And it's so cheap as well, like this is just a great counter in general. I also run 3 Gorgon's Gaze. This one, it's an interesting one because it doesn't gain you any tempo, but the utility here is massive. So Gorgon's Gaze, of course, just prevents an Elestral from attacking. It suppresses effect, negates any effects that are already on the stack, prevents it from nexusing, ascending. So this is just a great way to stop the opponent from being able to do powerful effects, powerful ascensions if they have it, just shut stuff out. Like Griffuse is a perfect example. You can shut down the Hydrakes and Twindras from being able to ascend if you time it right. It can even create just so many interesting board states where you can like shut down power attacks from stuff like Volcaries and Tectoros and punish the opponent. So it's a hard to explain all the things that Gorgon's Gaze is good for because it's a highly versatile card. So it's an automatic 3 of in really most decks, and especially in this one, just to stop again the opponent from getting so far ahead, kind of like Tsunami, but more versatile. Does cost a bit more though. Then of course, 3 Poison Tipped Arrow, moving into more of the standard rune package that we've been seeing for a while. Great way to just kind of control the board. That -2 attack can sometimes come in handy to make it so that my opponent cannot attack over maybe like a big Moustacean body or like an Apharos, but more importantly, you can just get Elestrals off of the board so they can't really progress their game state, even if they can, well, they can progress the game state by attacking over stuff sometimes, but it means they're not getting as far ahead as they would like. So 3 copies of this is pretty standard. This is also good for a similar reason as Earthquake, since we're not doing too much. It also means that if, say, like an Astrabbit, my opponent plays that, or just any more defensive play in general, I can flick up Poison Tip there and still deal with it without now having to attack and deal with counter runes for my slower deck. Then, of course, 3 Shield of Achilles, great against offensive decks to keep them off of bodies on board and protect our stuff. So like using it to stop an Apharos from being destroyed can help us net more card gain. And also this card is great if my opponent gets a bit, I don't know the word, just they feel like they maybe need to attack with something that normally has protection that maybe like an Earthquake can't deal with. Shield of Achilles is just super versatile for that. Not usually the case with that one, but still nonetheless great for just tempo gain and protecting this stuff as a battle trick. And wrapping up the main deck, 2 Ambrosia just for that recovery. Bit more versatile as a rune than the Sluggle, as it lets us get back more than just water spirits to be able to use multiple cards, such as Earthquakes. As you'll see in my spirit deck, I do not run enough Earth Spirits to be able to use all 3 Earthquakes. But also just not having to use the normal cast to recover spirits, and a spirit heavy deck is super important. So I think the Ambrosias are great for that. And we plus enough with Apharos that a lot of the times just getting Ambrosia as one of the cards to help loop back spirits is super handy, and we don't actually necessarily, like, we don't need another Elestral in hand, so why not run some Ambrosias to recover some spirits and still get more out of our cards. For the Spirit deck, I run 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 15 Leviaphin, because this is a water-focused deck, so of course we want enough water spirits to facilitate that strategy. But more importantly are the out-of-element stuff, as that's where spirit management becomes very important. So I run the 4 Teratlas and 1 Lycarus. So if you notice from my deck, I run 3 Earthquake, but I only expect to see it once, maybe twice in a game. So the 4 Teratlas is fine. And of course I have Ambrosia Loopback Spirits if I draw one later in the game and need those. And then of course the 1 of Lycarus for the Peliquarius. I only expect to use 1 on average. And again, I've got Ambrosia Loopback if I need to use the second Peliquarius. And honestly, if I really need an Elestral on board and have nothing else, Water Spirit on Peliquarius sometimes is fine as well. And that's the other thing I forgot to mention about Ambrosia. A lot of times I don't like playing it right when I draw it. I like to hold it in case I need to loop back specific spirits, or I know I'm going to die next turn, so I need the recovery. So definitely don't just fire off your Ambrosia all willy-nilly. Then moving over to the side deck, because I do have one, definitely highly arguable, but I noticed one big weakness to this deck is actually Volterra, or really a deck that doesn't care that you're stalling too much and just likes to try to build up to big things, be super aggressive, and just kind of combo off later on. And like the Volterra deck specifically also has Voltempest, which is super, like Voltempest and Exaltair to burn, so they don't even care about your defense. They just kind of go over the top. So I wanted a way to do that, and a way to kind of be a bit more aggressive, be able to more efficiently answer their pieces. So that's kind of what I focused on. So like I run 2 Krakkid. This is great to cast off of Foamee. If maybe my opponent's on a Pantera, I can easily spawn this out and shut down that Pantera. Or honestly, if I have it in hand, just throw it down, stop the Pantera's effect, and Earthquake it. Easy enough. I also run an extra Moustacean, as it's just a big body to sit on that I can also switch its attack around. So the important thing here is if, say, my opponent tries to throw out a Hydrake, I can just choose not to switch the attack so I can't Crash Chain. So that's great, because Galaxea does have that unfortunate weakness. Run an extra Sluggle in case I need a bit more recovery against those decks. I think the deck just needs to be a bit more aggressive, just to not give the opponent time to set up those. So Sluggle kind of goes a bit against that, but at the same time, I think there might be some similar decks where it can come up. I also run 3 Verutaqua, because this is like the best piece to Parasay Tsunami to slow down their offense and just shut it down. It's great into Pantera to shut down its effects as well, or like a Twindra or a Hydrake as well. So that way I don't even have to deal with their effects. I don't have to use a Gorgon's Gaze. I just have more tools to answer those big threats, and I have more leeway instead of having to like really pick and choose with like my Earthquakes and my Gorgon's Gaze specifically. 3 Pandora's Box. This one's less so against them, more just in general to stop some great utility cards. It's relevant in that deck because it can stop Griffuses. I don't know if that deck actually runs Griffuse, but it can stop Griffuse in Voltempest focused decks, and the Volterra deck specifically stops Twindras, Panteras, Hydrakes, you name it, and the Aeolus searches if they're trying to find Exaltair. 1 extra Ambrosia for some recovery if I need the full 3, because the pressure's put on and I just need that extra recovery. And then 1 Rise From in case I want just a little extra way to be able to build out a board. It is very expensive, but maybe just against some decks that little extra aggression. Not necessarily, I don't think Volterra might be the case. It could be. I really need to test it. If you can't tell, this is all theory here. But just an extra way to throw out a body to kind of put on some pressure sounds really great. So that's kind of the idea of the side deck. I think against most other decks, you can usually play a way around it. In this deck, you have capabilities, but that one is a hard counter, so I kind of want to focus my side deck around that. Again, as I said, this is all theory. And of course, as the side deck, just tune to your local meta. If you find that there's another deck that really gives you trouble with this deck, maybe you can run some extra stuff in here to help you deal with that. But also with such a limited card pool, I imagine that a lot of these cards might be the same. Only thing I could think of maybe you might want to run is some Tornadoes to give you some room control. That would be understandable. Personally, I don't like going that route just because it's temporary. I don't think this deck puts on enough pressure to deal with it, and a lot of times you kind of want your opponent to use it, so they're using up the spirits anyway. But that's my take. And just to kind of summarize again the game plan in general, as a mid-range deck, you really want to have a slow, more control start. So really in your opening hand, you want to find stuff like your Foamees to be obnoxious bodies on board, Apharos plus either Trident or ideally Poseidon start drawing cards, Moustacean's fine as a big body, and Peliquarius to search out your stuff, especially if you're going first. And then with a slew of some counterins such as Tsunami, Gorgon's Gaze, PTA, Shield of Achilles to start controlling the board, and Earthquake isn't a bad grab as well, just to make sure you have access to it in case your opponent starts going big and you need to deal with it. And once your opponent gets down to about 8 to 10 spirits, you can start aggressing by ascending in stuff like Capregal to attack over stuff that's 7 attacks, spawn more bodies to be able to ascend in later turns and just have more bodies on board to attack with. Or if you have more defensive bodies on board, such as Apharos or the Moustacean, you can throw down a Galaxea to turn them all into good attackers to start aggressing that way. I almost forgot to mention the interaction of Trident of Poseidon with the Galaxea or Moustacean and their stat flipping effects with this card's attack gain. So how it would go is the attack buff from Trident is applied first, and then the swap is applied second. Therefore, Trident doesn't really give anything plus attack in that scenario. So the only time that you're really giving Trident attack, at least for big numbers, will most likely be with Capregal or if you're not swapping stats. So do keep that in mind. There is a hard limit, Moustacean at 6 attack and Galaxea at 5 attack itself to keep in mind. So you're not really making that big of numbers. So when I say Trident's there for its lockdown to prevent your opponent from using counter runes, I really mean it. That's really what it is there for. So I figured I'd show off a quick little hand with this to point out what you want to keep and, well, what kind of hands look like that you want to keep and which ones you want to mulligan. So looking through this hand here, got a big body on board and some counter runes as well. So this actually is not a terrible hand, even if it comes down to expending to draw. That's a lot of times fine in the early game. And my opponent's definitely not getting off to the races as well. So this one seems like an alright keep. Of course, ideally, we would want to see maybe like a Foamee, or we would want to see like an Apharos also to draw, but with plenty of counter runes and at least an Elestral to cast, this hand looks a-okay. And another one just for good measure here. So we've got PTA Tsunami, Apharos, Ambrosia, and Galaxea. So unfortunately, nothing really to make use of the Ambrosia here, but Galaxea is still alright. It's not the best here, but with 2 counter runes, you can definitely protect it and kind of start putting on some pressure. But you might even just want to expend to draw here just to find stuff, because you have Tsunami, you have Poised to Bear, so you can't even fall that far behind. So let's even say we just expend here to draw to see what else we get. And another Apharos isn't great, but it's still fine, because you can still Tsunami to stop stuff and start putting on pressure with Galaxea early on, and even let's see our next draw, Moustacean, so we even have like another big body to stall to pair with it. We can even Poised to Bear to keep him off in Elestral if we want to just go Moustacean first as well. So there are definitely really great options to start out with here. As for what you want to expend for that mulligan, 2 Leviaphin. I usually like to try to get 3 Leviaphin into the underworld as soon as possible, just to make sure my Sluggle is always live and you still got plenty other of water spirits to go from there. So once you get those 3 in, you can start looking to expend your Teratlas, or maybe you haven't found a Peliquarius and you have an Ambrosia, you can always expend Leviaphin. That is all perfectly acceptable. So that is my Capregal deck, or at least the version I am testing right now. I love this deck, so I'm going to keep trying new stuff. And the game itself is in a very volatile state in terms of deck building right now, because so many new players are coming in, so many deck ideas are being thrown around and optimized, that it's kind of hard to say, especially for like the side deck, what will be optimal and what cards do I need to change out to make this more optimal against what I am facing. So I don't know if I'll update this for set 1 again, but probably around set 2, I'll be looking to revisit this deck for sure. And I'll definitely keep testing on it. So if anyone ever wants an updated list, I can definitely always provide it down in the description below. And I'll try to keep an updated list down there as well. No promises on when I'll update it or if I will, but you always can feel free to ask down in the comments below. But speaking of that, I want to know, what cards do you run in your Capregal deck if you are running one? What differences do you have to my deck, and why? I love to have that conversation down in the comments below. And I'm sure at some point I'll upload some gameplay of this deck, whether it be on the app or IRL against LUCK. So once I do post that video, I'll definitely link it down in the description below so you can get an idea with my usual voiceover, so you can see fully of how I pilot this deck, because I do think that information is very important. So if you're interested in that video and any more content, please consider subscribing and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I do upload that. But with that being said though, look forward to more content coming out real soon.